Magic cards sometimes age in weird ways. They don't get weaker or stronger in a vacuum, the game around them shifts, and suddenly yesterday's terror is today's draft common. With this in mind, this list looks at some old Magic cards that were once formidable in competitive play, but now seem very bad by today's standards. Early decks were built with smaller card pools and had very different incentives. Within those ecosystems, many of these so-called bad cards did exactly the job the metagame required them to do. Some were rate monsters at the time. Others were glue pieces for prison decks. A few were simply the best option from a limited selection. Let's kick off with Waterspout Djinn. Back in 1997, a 4-mana 4/4 flyer was a sizable threat, even with a mean drawback. It was apparently so pushed that it even appeared in competitive merfolk tribal decks, despite not being a merfolk. Like the Djinn, Org was very menacing by 90s standards. The catch was that your opponent pacifisms it just by leaving a 3-power creature untapped, and Org can't even block those bodies anyway. At the time, however, this creature frequently showed up in tier deck lists. Next up is Jade Statue, a 4-mana artifact that animates into a 3/6 during combat if you pay 2 mana. It sounds painfully inefficient, but at Worlds 1994, it was a full 4 of in a top 8 list. The reason was timing. Because it was only a creature during combat, it dodged Wrath of God and control magic. Plus, its 6 toughness stood taller than Juzam Djinn or Urnam Djinn, and most removal couldn't touch it outside Swords to Plowshares. Slow as it was, Jade Statue was a legitimate control weapon. Sometimes you just needed a closer that ignored Swords to Plowshares. Enter Deadly Insect. 5 mana, Shroud, trades with most things, but is untargetable by the premier removal spells of the era. In a sense, it was the Carnage Tyrant of its time. Early Sly pilots were still figuring out their curve, and the creature pool was rough. Orcish Spy is a 1/1 with a very weak ability. Nevertheless, the creature appeared in competitive mono-red decks in its time, simply because there weren't that many 1-drops to choose from. By today's standards, a green creature giving your opponent's Forest Walk is a hefty downside. In the mid-90s, however, it didn't matter. Urnam Djinn's raw stats were unmatched. A 4-mana 4/5 was enormous in a world where Serra Angel was a headliner. Decks like Urnam Geddon turned the supposed drawback into nothing by wiping lands with Armageddon or sacrificing them with Zurin Orb. By today's math, a 3-mana 2/3 with an anti-flyer trick on blocks is below rate but not embarrassing. The wild part is how omnipresent Woolly Spider was in the early 90s. For a while, this creature was a staple in green decks. 7 mana for an 8/8 that won't untap naturally and makes you pay 8 life to refresh it sounds like a trap. In the artifact broken Urza's block, it was a premier payoff. Solarian Academy ramped it out fast, Tinker could cheat it out as early as turn 2, with quasi-unblockable text baked in. Colossus was a brutal finisher until its enablers were banned or restricted. A 0/4 wall that pings for 1 mana sounds laughable, until you realize it was tailor-made to prey on rebels. In Mercadian Mask's block, rebels dominated with their endless small tutors, and Stinging Barrier stonewalled them. Its toughness blanked most attacks, and its ability sniped key pieces like Ramosian Sergeant. Combined with mana denial tools like Rising Waters or with opposition shells, Barrier flipped matchups pretty much on its own. While we're on the topic of Rebels, in 2000 to 2001, Rebels decks ruled standard and block formats, chaining tutors with Linsivy and Ramosian Sky Marshal, etc. Joval Queen was often the top of the chain. A single copy could often run away with the game. It didn't need to be flashy, it was simply the sturdy hammer Rebels wanted once they'd established overwhelming inevitability. Ironclaw Orcs is a nerfed red grizzly bears. Nevertheless, early red aggro decks were so desperate for curve fillers that pretty much anything costing between 1 and 3 with a red pip made the cut. Gold Knight Castigator has beefy stats for the mana cost, but its downside is that all damage dealt to it is doubled, as is all damage dealt to you. That sounds like a deal breaker. In 2016 Standard, however, it was the perfect aggro closer. It survived common removal like Roast or Languish, while it crashed in for huge hasty damage. Red decks cared little about their own life totals if the opponent's clock was shorter. A meme card if there ever was one. Win the game at your upkeep if your library has 200 or more cards in it. Yet in 2002, William Huey Jensen took a 244 card Battle of Wits deck to a Grand Prix top 8. Thanks to tutors and a mountain of redundancy, the deck was surprisingly consistent. A 2/2 for 1 that switches sides to whichever player has the highest life total. Somehow, green aggro decks still maxed on this card in the 1990s. 2 mana for an artifact that pings opponents with 7 or more cards in hand seems weak. But in 2006, Howling Mine decks made it a legitimate win con. Using Howling Mine, Kami of the Crescent Moon, and endless bounce spells, the deck stuffed your opponent's hand while denying them mana. Once they were locked at 7 cards, Ebony Owl Netsuke started firing for 4 damage a turn. White-blue for a 2/2 with pro-red sounds like a sideboard curio now, probably a niche tool in Pauper. In Invasion block, however, Galena's Knight was a format weapon. Pro Tour Tokyo 2001 revolved around Flame Tongue Kavu, and one of that tournament's most successful decks packed tons of protection creatures, like Galena's Knight, that turned FTK into a self-immolating liability. While Time Elemental is most famous for the misprint where its art ended up on Serra Angel, it also saw competitive play in 1994. Its activated ability, bouncing any unenchanted permanent, proved potent. That year, it helped win the first Magic World Championship as part of a prison shell with Meekstone, Stasis, and Winter Orb. Time Elemental let you pick up your own lock pieces at the end of the opponent's turn, untap freely, and then redeploy them. A vanilla 1/1 for 1 has no home today in any format. In 2001, it helped a standard Merfolk deck take second place at Worlds. The trick was opposition plus static orb. Your cheap bodies tap down lands and creatures while orb froze untaps. With Lord of Atlantis as basically the only payoff, even the humble 1-drop pulled weight by fueling the prison. In the mid-90s, this 2/2 flyer for 5 was a nightmare for opponents. It came back after dying, it skipped your next draw step, but this was basically irrelevant in control decks packed with extra card draw, and it could also exile itself on command. Its recursion let it blank sweepers like Pyroclasm or Yokelhorps. For a while, this clunky little flyer was a premier control finisher. Even in a standard environment as busted as Mirrodin block, Arkslogger still cut through. It was a major threat in big red decks, capable of dishing out surprising amounts of damage, often picking off blockers to let other beaters like Rorik's Bladewing crash through. 5 mana to replace damage with milling is clunky and symmetrical. On paper, it doesn't do all that much. In practice, however, Tinker Welder Shells used it as a timed shield. Cheat it in to stall aggro, then cash it in when you're ready to land the real threat. It was a clever way of buying time. 3 mana for an artifact that becomes a 3/3 only if you tap all your lands? That sounds pretty atrocious, but as with Jade's statue, the trick was in the timing. Because it was only a creature when you wanted, it dodged sorcery speed removal, and crucially Flametongue Kavu's ETB effect. In a standard warped by FTK, Idol was the perfect answer. It showed up in top 8s, in the Pro Tour, and at Worlds. 4 mana to cast, 4 mana to tap, and you draw a single card. By modern standards, that's absurdly weak. Yet in the mid-90s, this was a serious card advantage machine, seeing Pro Tour play. Control decks paired it with Ivory Tower to grind opponents into dust. Phyrexian Ironfoot looks like dead weight, but in 2007 Standard it was shockingly well positioned. Shriekmaw couldn't hit artifacts, Nameless Inversion didn't reach 4 toughness, and Shadow Mage Infiltrator ran headfirst into it. It was even resilient against Cryptic Command's tap mode, since you could just pay to untap it. For all these reasons, this uncommon became a defensive all-star across multiple tier decks. Jotun Grunt is a 4/4 for 2 that eats 2 cards from a graveyard as its cumulative upkeep cost. However, back in 2007, when Dredge was running wild, this drawback flipped into an upside. Death and Taxes lists ran it both as a massive body and main deckable graveyard hate. A 4-mana 5/5 that taxes all your green spells feels like a nightmare. But in the early 2000s, Jade Leech was an honest-to-goodness curve topper. In red-green Fires decks, it could even come down with haste thanks to Fires of Yavimaya, and its size let it tank Flametongue Kavu's 4 damage. As long as you dropped it last, the tax was manageable, and in those metagames, rate was everything. A 4-mana 2/2 flyer that can bounce itself back to hand doesn't seem like anything special today. In 1996, however, it was Control's go-to immortal. It blocked endlessly, it dodged all removal, it survived sweepers, and it kept coming back to slowly wear your opponents down. In a meta where inevitability mattered more than speed, Blinking Spirit was a finisher that refused to die. On paper, this sorcery screams jank thanks to its inconsistency. Until Draco showed up, that is. Pairing Explosion with the Artifact Dragon meant 16 damage straight to the dome. With Scroll Rack to fix the top, Draco Explosion decks stole extended tournaments. Modern has flashier equivalents, but in 2002 this combo was brutally efficient. The card Calibrated Blast is a superior sequel to Erratic Explosion. Epic is often mocked as one of Magic's weakest mechanics, but Enduring Ideal was the exception. 7 mana to fetch an enchantment each upkeep, with the trade-off that you can't cast spells for the rest of the game. The catch became the game plan. Once you landed it, every turn pulled another prison piece, like Form of the Dragon, Ivory Mask, or Confiscate. Eventually, your opponent was suffocated. Enduring Ideal top-8'd Worlds in 2005 and remained a real archetype for years. In the mid-1990s, Storm Shaman was incredibly useful. That wall of toughness significantly slowed early aggro creatures, and if you left enough mana up, it could suddenly punch above its weight thanks to its fire breathing. Nobody ever wanted to pay 10 mana for a 13/13 with upkeep costs, but as graveyard fodder, Prosan Cloudscraper proved to be perfect. Cephalid Breakfast decks milled themselves with Shuko and Illusionist combos, then exiled the Cloudscraper to Sutured Ghoul, creating an instant one-hit kill with Dragon Breath giving haste. In the late 90s, haste was rare, making Telroom Minotaur surprisingly decent. It even posted Pro Tour finishes. Sometimes simply arriving a turn earlier than expected was enough to steal games in an era with fewer efficient threats. Alone, Brine Elemental was a pricey 5/4 that made your opponents skip an untap step. Paired with Vesuvan Shapeshifter, however, it created an infinite lock. Each upkeep, you could flip the Shapeshifter face down and back up, re-triggering Brine's effect. Opponents never untapped again. This Pickles Lock deck was a genuine force in Standard. Speaking of forces, back in 1995, Force of Nature was the king of the battlefield despite its hefty upkeep cost. Bigger than anything else and far more reasonable than other giants like Leviathan or Colossus of Sardia, Force could be powered out with mana dorks and ended games in a few swings. Protection from white on a 5/5 for 6 doesn't wow modern eyes, but in 1996/1997, white dominated Magic. Swords to Plowshares couldn't touch Isan's Shade, Sarah Angel couldn't block it, and its toughness meant it was safely out of lightning bolt range. With Dark Ritual, you could even slam it early. Not for nothing, this card won multiple Pro Tours. A 4-mana 3/4 flyer that taps all your lands at end of turn seems anti-blue. But in 2000-2001 standard, free spells like Daze, Foil, and Misdirection meant blue decks often didn't need mana on the opponent's turn anyway. That turned Troublesome Spirit into a surprisingly efficient, evasive threat. In the late 90s, Spirit of the Night was a feared payoff, the Atraxa of its era. This 9-mana monstrosity has flying, trample, haste, protection from black, and first strike while attacking. Too expensive to cast, but a nightmare when reanimated. Recurring Nightmare plus Survival of the Fittest put it onto the battlefield very early, presenting an evasive, resilient finisher. Few decks could answer it cleanly. A humble artifact that recycles the top card of your graveyard back into your library. In 1990s Stasis decks, this card was WinCon insurance. While you decked the opponent under a lock, Digger ensured that you never ran out of cards yourself. While Dragonstorm isn't super bad, it's more of a casual card these days. Yet in Time Spiral Standard, it was a competitive powerhouse. Originally ignored, Dragonstorm exploded onto the scene in 2006 thanks to the perfect support package. Rite of Flame, Seething Song, and Lotus Bloom built the storm count, then Dragonstorm fetched multiple Begotten Hellkites to instantly end games. 4 Hellkites meant 20 direct damage on resolution. The deck won Worlds and remained competitive for years. Later, Dragonstorm even became a lethal combo card for Blazing Shoal in Modern Infect, its high mana value making it the perfect exile fuel. 4 mana for 3 slow -1/-1 counters seems weak. Yet Serrated Arrows was a dominant tool of the mid to late 90s. The format overflowed with fragile X1s, Mana Dorks, Jackal Pup, Savannah Lions. Arrows picked each of them off one by one. It was repeatable, colorless removal that slipped through protection, and it saw heavy play for over a decade. It continued to appear in Pauper for a long time after that. In vintage Shops decks from 2011 to 2016, Slash Panther was a genuine terror. With Mishra's Workshop, Ancient Tomb, and the Moxen of course, you could slam it down on turn 1 and immediately pressure your opponent or their planeswalkers, Jace the Mind Sculptor in particular. For years, the Panther was the go-to hasty threat in colorless shells, until Fleetwheel Cruiser and others replaced it. On paper, Chronotog looks like a joke. A 2-mana 1/2 that trades your next turn for a temporary +3/+3. Yet this supposed downside became the backbone of early Stasis prison decks. With Stasis freezing untaps, Chronotog's skip a turn ability became a weapon. You could give your opponent more turns that they couldn't use. While we're talking about extra turns, 6 mana for a 5/5 that can return from a graveyard if you skip your next turn doesn't sound especially playable. Yet Gabriel Nassif piloted it to a World's Top 8 in 2006. His Martyr Tron deck gained absurd life with Martyr of Sands and Proclamation of Rebirth, so time didn't matter. In a removal-heavy, grindy environment, Gerard's Wisdom was a genuine stabilizer. Back in the day, control decks holding big hands would routinely gain 10 to 14 life off this sorcery, buying turns to let their millstones or other win cons finish the job. This goofy purple hippo is now infamous as one of the go-to group hug commanders, but once it was a legitimate combo piece. In 1999 Oath of Druids lists, you wanted your opponent to control more creatures than you so that Oath would trigger only for you. One of Feldergriff's drawback abilities, making tokens for your opponent, became the engine that kept Oath online. Before Forbidden Orchard existed, the Griff was the perfect enabler. Phyrexian Warbeast is a 3/4 artifact creature for 3 that punishes you when it leaves the battlefield, causing you to sack a land and lose a life. Yet in the mid-90s, it was simply the biggest thing in its slot. It dodged Bolt, Terror, and most removal, while bullying the fragile protection creatures that dominated the scene. Its downside rarely triggered, making it a reliable bruiser that aggressive decks leaned on. 8 mana for a flyer whose stats depend on instants in graveyards seems like a bulk rare. But in 2002, Oath of Druids decks weaponized it. Since Oath mills cards until it hits a creature, Cognivore would enter play already enormous. Justin Gary won Pro Tour Houston with this exact plan. If there's a moral here, it's humility. Today's bulk was yesterday's boogeyman, and tomorrow's power creep will make fools of us all. That's all we have time for today. Until next time, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and consider joining my Patreon. Also, let me know in the comments of any other bad cards that used to be really good.